All right, so let's dive right into this election cycle. Um, we're going deep on this recent interview with Vice President Kamala Harris, and it is fascinating, like how much they pack into this interview. We're talking like hot button issues, carefully worded non-answers, the whole shebang.
Well, and I think what's really striking is how the interviewer just goes straight for immigration right out the gate. I mean, clearly this is a really top-of-mind issue for voters this time around.
Absolutely. He does not shy away from it. And, he brings up the influx of immigrants that we've been seeing and, how that's really become a major point of contention.
Yeah, yeah, and, Harris's response, it's almost like textbook political maneuvering. When he asks her point blank about the number of immigrants released into the U.S. under the Biden administration, she just completely avoids giving a straight answer.
It's painful to listen to. It's like he asks for a number, any number, and she keeps steering the conversation toward the need for comprehensive immigration reform. It's like, we get it, but it feels so evasive.
It really makes you wonder, I mean, are those numbers just so politically damaging that they just can't be addressed directly? And the interviewer picks up on that. He doesn't let up. He brings up the elephant in the room, which is the reversal of Trump's Remain in Mexico policy. And he goes even further to highlight what that decision means in the real world.
And this is where it gets really heartbreaking. He brings up Jocelyn Burdick, whose daughter was tragically murdered by someone who was released into the U.S. because of this policy change. I mean, her story is just devastating.
It really drives home the human cost of these policy decisions, right? Burdick puts a blame squarely on the Biden-Harris administration for her daughter's death. And even former President Clinton has weighed in, saying that stricter vetting might have prevented this tragedy.
It raises so many questions, like where does the accountability lie? Should there be an apology? And how do we separate these individual stories from this larger debate about immigration policy?
You've got to look at both, right? And this is where the interviewer brings up the bipartisan border bill. Do you remember how even though the Border Patrol union supported it, they ended up endorsing Trump and criticizing Harris's record on border security?
It's such a head-scratcher. Why support the bill and then criticize the administration that backs it?
It's a fascinating paradox, right? And then you add in the fact that 6 Democrats actually voted against that very same bill. It's like there's so much more going on beneath the surface.
Okay, so we've got the Border Patrol unions seemingly playing both sides, Democrats internally divided. It sounds like this bill was anything but straightforward. What's the deal here?
Well, the bill itself was a compromise. It had provisions that satisfied some, but not all. The Border Patrol union may have initially been on board, but felt pressure from their members, or maybe certain parts of the bill didn't sit well with their overall stance on border security. It's hard to say for sure.
And what about those 6 Democrats who voted against it? Were they just fundamentally opposed to the bill's approach, or were there specific elements they couldn't get behind?
It's really tough to say without knowing your exact reasoning, but it just goes to show how incredibly complex immigration reform is. Even within a single party, you have this spectrum of views on the best way forward. And finding solutions that address border security, humanitarian aid, and economic impact, it's a real balancing act.
Yeah, it's like everyone wants a simple answer to this really complicated issue. And speaking of complicated, the interviewer then throws it back to Harris's own words from her 2019 presidential campaign.
Oh yeah, he goes there.
Yeah.
He brings up her stance on driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants, in-state tuition, even healthcare. And these weren't just like vague campaign promises, right? These were concrete policy positions.
Exactly. And the interviewer really presses her on this. He points out the contrast between those 2019 stances and her current emphasis on, enforcing federal law. So is this a change of heart or just a change in strategy now that she's in the White House?
Tough question. And of course, Harris emphasizes that viewpoints evolve. She acknowledges that 2019 was a different time and that now as vice president, she's committed to upholding federal law.
It's a very calculated response, though, right? She doesn't completely disavow her previous stance, which could alienate some on the left, but she also emphasizes her commitment to current law, which plays to a more moderate or even conservative base.
Bundling both sides and hoping nobody notices the strings. Right? And then the interviewer throws in this fascinating detail that throws a wrench in everything. He mentions that her own running mate, Tim Walz, actually signed similar measures into law in Minnesota.
Oh, wow. I totally missed that. So on one hand, she's talking about upholding federal law, and on the other, her own running mate is enacting more lenient policies at the state level. How do you square that circle?
That's a great question, and it just goes to show you the complexities of governing, especially on an issue like immigration. What works in one state or during a campaign might not be feasible at the national level,
Absolutely, and it makes you wonder how much of this is about genuine policy evolution versus just adapting to the political landscape. But before we get too deep into that, the interviewer throws a total curveball. He brings up a Trump campaign ad about taxpayer-funded sex change surgeries for prisoners.
Whoa, talk about a 180. From immigration to that, it seems totally out of left field, but it's actually a pretty clever way to put Harris on the spot about another potentially controversial issue.
Yeah, and he doesn't hold back. He asks her directly about her stance on this, specifically regarding undocumented immigrants and inmates. How does she handle that?
Harris doesn't flinch. She sticks to her guns. Follow the law. But then she turns the tables. She points out that similar surgeries were reportedly available under the Trump administration as well, based on medical necessity.
Which is a brilliant countermove. It takes the focus off the act itself and puts it on the underlying principle that medical decisions should be based on need, not political expediency.
100%. Yeah. She completely reframes the narrative of that Trump campaign ad, turning it from an attack on taxpayer dollars into a discussion about consistent application of medical care, regardless of immigration status.
Yeah, it's like she judo flipped the whole thing right back at him. But it makes you wonder about consistency, especially when it comes to those big campaign promises. Like her slogan, "A new way forward." The interviewer calls her out on it, saying, "You've been VP for 4 years. What's new? Where's the forward?"
The question everyone wants answered, right? And Harris, she actually tackles it head on. She says, look, a Harris presidency wouldn't just be Biden 2.0. She'd bring her own experience and a fresh perspective.
She even goes so far as to say she represents a new generation of leadership. But didn't she say in a previous interview that there's literally nothing she would have done differently as VP?
Yeah, the interviewer brings up that exact clip. It's a pretty glaring contradiction. How can you have a new way forward if you're basically saying you're fine with the current path?
And if that weren't enough, he drops another bombshell into the conversation. Those polls that show a majority of Americans think the country's headed in the wrong direction. So given that she's part of the current administration, how does Harris convince voters that she's the one to turn things around?
$1 million question right there.
Yeah.
And Harris's answer? Well, she points the finger at the previous administration, which is pretty common tactic, but not always effective.
It's like that old saying, you break it, you bought it, but applied to the entire country. Blaming the past only gets you so far, especially when you're the ones currently in charge.
And the interviewer seems to pick up on that.
Yeah.
He circles back around to that 60 Minutes interview where Harris named Iran as the greatest threat facing the U.S., which is interesting because a lot of experts at the time, and even now, see China as a much bigger geopolitical threat.
It was a bold statement, to say the least. But then he points out that despite calling Iran public enemy #1, the administration's actions, like easing some of those sanctions, don't really back that up.
Right. It makes you wonder, were those actions part of a larger strategy, or were they concessions made for other, maybe political reasons? And with those recent attacks on Israel by Iran-backed groups, you have to question how effective the current administration's approach really is.
It feels like there's a disconnect between the words and the actions, which I think really sums up a lot of what we've been talking about today.
I think so. This deep dive into Harris's interview, it's really revealing about the strategy and the thinking behind her words. It's a very fine line she's walking, trying to appeal to different groups within her party and the wider electorate.
For sure. And it feels like we've uncovered more questions than answers today. But I guess that's the sign of a good deep dive, right? It makes you realize how much is going on beneath the surface of these very calculated interviews and statements.
Absolutely. And as we head into this election, it's so important to think critically about what we're hearing from all the candidates, to weigh their track records alongside their promises for the future.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, the choice is yours. What does a new way forward actually mean to you? And who has the experience, the vision, and the consistency to deliver it? Those are the questions you got to ask as you're navigating all the noise of this election cycle. We'll be back with another deep dive soon, but until then, stay curious.